Hi, I'm Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work, and life in a more successful and sustainable way. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing a fellow burnout survivor. Like me, she's passionate about supporting working mothers to avoid burnout, because once you've been there and you've experienced the consequences, you damn sure want to make sure another mother never has to go through it. Dr. Jacqueline Kerr is a mother, behavioural scientist and burnout survivor. She's in the top 1% of most cited scientists worldwide. Dr. Kerr left her position as a public health professor in 2018 after her burnout experience and is now on a mission to dismantle the causes of working mum burnout. Her TEDx talk provides solutions that we can all use to change the social norms around burnout, and I'm delighted that she's here to share these insights with you. What we cover in this episode will blow your mind. Dr. Kerr goes into broad in terms of really exploring all of the different influences of burnout, and deep in terms of the different levels and layers to it. So I think you're going to find so much richness in this conversation. I know it's going to be a good one, and I can't wait for you to dive in. So welcome, Dr. Jacqueline. I am absolutely thrilled that you're joining me on the podcast to talk about one of my favourite subjects.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So I'd love to start with your story. For those that don't know you, could you take us back to that kind of day on the 3rd of January 2018 when you had that life-changing experience, which your kind of TED talk really kind of dives into?
Right. And of course, as you mentioned, the 3rd of January. And I think that was part of it. I just couldn't face another year. So I had a really busy Christmas with the kids. My husband hadn't actually taken any time off over the Christmas period. And we hadn't even had a conversation about that. That was kind of the some of the issue in our relationship. You know, he was just assuming he did what he did and there was no conversation. I was the one looking after the kids, yet I had such a busy job. I was a professor at the university, bringing in millions of dollars in research. I had a very large research group that I was looking after. And I kept on taking on more leadership at the university, thinking that I needed to keep improving myself in that way. And so I was so overwhelmed at work. And then I started to really notice that I was also overwhelmed at home. And I had spoken to a colleague at one point saying, okay, you left academia. What was the key, indicator for you? And she goes, oh, I was crying on the way to work. And so I had gone through that phase of thinking, okay, I'm not crying on the way to work. And then suddenly I was crying on the way to work and on the way home, because what I was coming home to was so overwhelming for me as well. My son was really struggling at school, and later he was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And so we were just having challenges from all areas. And that particular day I had organized for my husband to take my daughter to the pediatrician just for a routine vaccination. And I was in a meeting, and then they came home and I was busy making dinner. And my husband was just so proud that he had done this thing, that he had taken my daughter to the pediatrician on his own for the first time. And I was unable to say thank you. And we had this huge fight about it. And he sort of said to me, it's not my fault. You no longer have friends or hobbies. And it cut me through so hard. And he was so right. Because there I was cooking dinner, hating every minute of it, having just absolutely loved cooking, having grown up with Delia Smith and Jamie Oliver and, oh my goodness, all the British greats, Mary Berry. I loved cooking, and now I hated it. It was such a chore, because actually one part of my son's diagnosis is hypersensitivity in his taste and smell. So it was really hard to make the fun foods that I enjoyed to make. So I was just in such a bad place. And after that row, that night, I sat in my room on my own. My husband, he was so mad with me that he went and slept elsewhere. And I just felt so alone. And I think that was a huge part of it. Being from the UK, but living in the US, I didn't feel like I did have anyone I could talk to. And obviously I was struggling to talk to my husband. So I literally on my phone, my iPhone, I just started to write a letter to my kids saying, I'm sorry, I'm not good enough. I'm sorry that I can't cope with being a mom and working and everything I do. And please, find a life for yourself that you can enjoy and be kind to yourself and spend time in nature. And I'm sorry that I couldn't do that and ask for help. And I'm sorry I couldn't ask for help. And so it was such a marker for me because I did it in my phone. That's how I knew the date, the 3rd of January, 2018. And, a year later, I was able to look at it and reflect on it again. And I didn't send it. And, I experienced, suicide ideation and for several weeks and maybe months after that, just kept thinking that was the only solution that would work for me. But the next day, I said to my husband, look, I wrote this letter to the kids last night. I'm not in a good place. And so that's when he said, okay, come on, we have to do something about this. You have to take a leave of absence from work. Please go and see somebody. And when I spoke then to a therapist, she very much was saying, it's so important that you don't do this for your kids. And so, that's not necessarily the message that everyone will help everyone. Not everyone wants to hear. But in those next few weeks, that was kind of the only thing I could hang on to. So that was really my lowest point. And from there, I had to kind of work out what I was going to change. And I think even part of my whole learning process was understanding my emotions. And one of the lessons I learned from this fantastic book, Dr. Carla McLaren, A Language of Emotions, was that even suicide ideation is basically telling you you need a new life. It's not that you need to end life, but you need a different life than the one you're living. It's your body and your brain telling you that. So when I understood that, I was like, that's true. I clearly had to change something. So again, I have friends who are clinical psychologists who really caution me about sharing my story in multiple ways. One, I'm not a suicide prevention expert, and I'm not talking about suicide prevention, so I have to be careful about that. Two, don't get to that stage. Burnout isn't when you're in that stage. Burnout starts 11 or 12 stages before that. So don't let yourself get to that stage. But when I asked my husband about this, he always has said, please share this story, because there's so many other husbands and dads out there that could be as lost as I was at that time, and they need to hear somebody talking about this. So that's why I do share it.
And thank you. I can hear the emotion that still comes with that story, and it's not surprising. And I am sure that there are going to be women listening to this that can relate to that. The crying on the way to work and the crying on the way home, and often we're high achieving, successful independent women that can't admit it to ourselves about how bad it's got. And often it takes kind of hitting that wall, which it sounds like you really painfully did, to really be willing to look at it for what it is. And as you're right, this isn't a podcast about suicide or suicide prevention, but it's a podcast where we tell stories that help others. And I'm so glad you are telling your story, because as you said, it's not only going to help other women, but also other partners that may not know that their partner is struggling.
Mm-hmm. And I think what that did is also then cascaded quite a few other reactions in me. So I think I had always been quite able to tolerate stress, and it was kind of like something broke, and my stress coping mechanism no longer worked. So I then started actually having panic attacks and just couldn't cope with anything. And I think a lot of people find when they hit burnout that it's not necessarily their brains that allow them to realize what they're in. It's their bodies that interrupt. And we often say, our bodies let us down, but actually it's the opposite. Our bodies are saying, stop, for goodness sake. And And so I didn't really listen to my brain, but I had to listen to my body, because it really did keep interrupting me, and I was really struggling. So yeah, it's often that it manifests in physical symptoms.
And that's exactly what mine did. So my burnout experience was 8 years ago, and very much my body kind of went, okay, you're not listening. I'm going to make you listen that this isn't working. So I can really relate to that. What I found fascinating in your TED talk was actually how your 2 decades as a behavioural scientist or behavioural change scientist really shaped how you responded to your burnout and how you then went through your recovery. So how did it kind of influence your perspective and then the actions you took, do you think?
And that's such a great question, actually. So I would say certainly my 2 decades as a behavior change scientist have really framed how I now think about solutions for burnout. But in some ways, when I took a leave of absence and then I went back to work, my body was sort of, my fight flight response was all calm, and I went back to work and the stress truck hit me. Oh my goodness. It was the first time in my life that I had really felt stress in my body, because I'd always just managed it in some way. So then I left the university and I kind of, in some ways, ran out with my hair on fire going, oh, behavior change, all this stuff, leave it behind. Probably, I can't do this. I'm not that person anymore. So in some ways, I spent my burnout recovery period really trying to fix the problem of me, trying to say, okay, this is my fault. Because again, that's the thing, when you're in a workplace and you've got difficult colleagues and challenges at work, you're quite often focused on blaming other people as much as yourself. But when you then leave, oh my goodness, the inner critic explodes so loud in your head. It's got no one else to focus on but you. So my inner critic, my Macbeth witch, is screaming at me that I'm a failure. So I'm blaming myself, and I'm in this mission of, what can I do to learn to fix myself? Because very much I'm a learner. That is my modality. As a researcher, I've always been through reading and learning. So that's kind of how I approached it. And how I thought about myself was, I'm a bad mom, a bad wife, and a bad colleague. And so I was really trying to think about, how can I become a better parent? What can I do to become a better manager? What can I do in my relationship? So I did read a lot of really useful books. I learned about love languages, which really helped me communicate with my husband. I learned about positive discipline as a parenting approach, where you're much less authoritarian than I was. And I think that's where, when this intersects with motherhood, was really part of my problem. When I became a mum, that's when I really started to dislike myself. And I think it was because I was parenting like an authoritarian parent, which was how I learned to parent from my parents. But it didn't sit well with me. I hated myself being this type of parent, but I didn't know another type of parenting. So as I started to learn that and really let go of being authoritarian, lots of benefits then happened in that and in my relationships. And so it was so interesting. Another book I read talked about behavior change, and it really got my radar up. And it was sort of saying, have self-compassion when you don't do the behaviors you're wanting to change. And I was like, interesting. None of our science mentions self-compassion. We have relapse prevention, which basically says you're going to fail, so accept it, just get back on on with it again. I'm like, huh. And another one was, what is the motivation for what you're doing? And we talk about motivations all the time and like finding one, but there are all these kind of should motivations. You should be doing exercise for your health. And so Tara Moore in this book, Playing Big, was very much saying, you have to do it from love. And I was like, well, that's a new one. How come that's not in our behavior change models? So I was kind of even so learning about it. And I think the things that I was successful at sort of doing, and that they really helped me, also was when I did have some of the support systems that you need in place for successful behavior change. So for me, I'm really successful when I have accountability partners, and that's something that's so important about our behavior change strategies. So an accountability partner for me has always been doing it as part of a class or part of a group. And then, I'm the perfect student who does all the homework. So I'm doing the work then. So, I did a stand-up comedy class because, one of the things, I realized I had no hobbies. I had nothing to get out of the house to do. So this was me starting to just take an afternoon once a week on a Sunday where I left the house. I went and I did this stand-up comedy class, and it was crazy. It was like therapy in itself, because basically as a new stand-up comic, you're mostly talking about the challenges you face and learning how to tell stories and then turn them into jokes. And so everybody there was struggling with something, and then we're all laughing at our own experience, and then we're all seeing ourselves frame these experiences differently because of the comedy. And then I did improv comedy. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm fascinated what drew you to that, because it's, as you say, actually as an outlet, it's fantastic, but incredibly scary to do as well. What prompted you to do that?
This is the problem, Nikki. I wanted to prove that I was funny to myself, to others around me. And that's the crux of this whole burnout cycle. So the 12 stages of Freudenberger and North's burnout cycle, the first step is need to prove yourself. And I was on that wheel again. So even though I learned masses from it, enjoyed it, I did come to the end, do the performance and go, now what? So what? I proved I could do it. It's still, didn't really resolve some of the issues. But I must admit, I found improv comedy actually more helpful, because there wasn't this kind of trying to prove yourself in a final performance, although you do frequent performances in improv. It's so much about bringing something to the stage that someone else builds upon, and then you build upon what they're doing. So it's this whole yes and mentality. You make mistakes, right? There's no perfectionism in it. You make mistakes and they become funny. And in fact, the group that I worked with was much less about let's be funny. It was about whatever you do, embrace it and show the fullest of emotions that you can. And that leads to funny. So there was me, my stiff upper lip Brit, not very good at showing emotions. And this was one of the issues, is not understanding and showing my emotions, and then actually practicing that each week as part of our improv class. So it was such a magical space for me. And I learned so much about letting go of control, making mistakes, but also what did I bring to the stage that was unique? Because you don't realize that your experience every day makes you bring some comment or thought. Yes. And you don't even know where it's come from, but it's uniquely you. And that was such a great lesson for me.
Oh, I love that. And in your brilliant TEDx talk, which I will absolutely be linking in the show notes so people, if they haven't watched it, can find it, you share this analogy of a baked Alaska dessert to describe the working mother experience, and I imagine makes sense of your own experience. For anyone who's not heard it yet, could you share it, please? Because I love a good analogy, and oh gosh, this is a good one.
Yes, and that was so fun because that's what I learned about TEDx. I mean, I've been a lecturer for decades, and I actually have been, a public speaker since I was about 10. So that's why I was kind of comfortable stepping onto the TEDx stage, because I only joined social media last year. So that was not a comfortable place for me. But I think in the TEDx stage, I can feel comfortable, but I still had to learn so much about sharing my story and using tools like analogies, which I hadn't had to use in my boring lectures. So I was so happy when I came across when the baked Alaska one hit me. And it was so funny because, again, I live in the US and I miss so many British things. But when my husband broke his leg really badly, we started watching the Great British Bake Off. And I was so happy to be hearing and seeing Mary Berry and Prue and all these people and all these, so sweet English people trying their best and helping each other. Oh, it was such a salve for my soul. And then literally 1 week, someone was doing this baked Alaska, and I think actually one of the contestants got so mad that his ice cream didn't freeze that he threw it in the trash can. And so it was like the rubbish bin. Sorry, there's my Americanisms. Anyway, it seemed like this such an example of disaster and mess. And I was like, oh yeah, that baked Alaskas are so challenging. And I suddenly went, oh, that's what, in some ways, motherhood is like. You've got this precious thing, your children, this delicious ice cream that you're trying to hold and preserve in the middle. And then you have this meringue outside that gets blowtorched. And it feels like that society is just expecting us to be this perfect person. But we're just constantly being barraged by judgments and criticisms and expectations. And it does feel like mission impossible trying to be a working mom. It's so hard to keep the ice cream from melting. And then it also helped me explain part of my science, which is the social ecological model. So in a baked Alaska, you have cake, sometimes fruit, ice cream, and then the meringue on the outside. So the cake is kind of like in the social ecological model. That's us as an individual. We bring something to whatever it is we're trying to do or whatever we're experiencing in the world. My need to please people, my perfectionism, I bring that to the table. That's the cake at the bottom. The next layer is the fruit, and that's your relationships. That's the sort of sweet things that you have, your relationships with your family and even colleagues. The next level is the ice cream. Now that's like your workplaces, healthcare institutions, educational systems. We're influenced by all of those. And if we want to change things, we either have to change within those contexts or try and change those contexts as well. And then on the outside is the burnt meringue, and that's society with its economic forces. Because, for example, if a woman tries to go and get a better job offer somewhere else, the economic forces as a whole pay women less. So we can't go and get a competitive job offer as easily as a man can. And then obviously policies, do you have paid leave? What are the things that are policies that help you be able to exist more healthily in society? Do you have places to exercise? Do you have healthy food stores nearby? And then society as a whole, our social norms. And, if you think about all these perfect Instagram posts, they're an example of how society puts expectations on us. And of course, we're influenced by all these things. But for me, the good news is, if we do change ourselves and we do change our relationships and we do come to work in a different way, bringing different ideas, and we do go into Instagram and post things differently, we also change the people around us and the systems around us. So a lot of people don't like to hear about those systems and feel like they're a victim. I say the reality is we're in them, so we need to think about them and deal with them. But also the hope is that when we start to influence change, it does percolate like ripples in a pond.
Oh, I love that. And my part of my coach training background is in systemic coaching, and it's absolutely paying attention to all of those systems that we have or do belong to. And some of them resource us and some of them entangle us. But if we haven't got that awareness, we've got these gravitational pulls, and we're just not, we're not empowering ourselves with that knowledge. So I love that you put it in that context.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think also just for self-compassion, right? It's like, okay, I'm doing a difficult thing. There's many barriers to what I'm trying to do, whatever that is. So you have self-compassion, but you also say, so is the person next to me. They're struggling with these societal things, rather going, oh, they're a failure. They failed on their diet. They're a terrible person, right? You're going, no, it's really hard to diet when you're surrounded by fast food. So, it's also that you then have compassion for other people who are struggling. You don't blame them. And I think that's what's so important about this self-blame. We really, really blame ourselves. And what that does, it makes us think that it's an individual problem. It's our problem. And the more we share our problems and share our stories, and everyone goes, oh, this isn't just my problem. the next person is experiencing, oh, actually, lots of mums are experiencing it. And once you start to go, there's a group of people, there's several groups of different groups of people, women of color, etc., who are experiencing these things differently. It's not just that we're potentially experiencing it more, we're experiencing it differently. When you think about the workplace, the things that the sort of typical, potentially, white male CEO may have experienced burnout in his life from overwork. And his solution to that is time management, delegation, hiring more people. Yes, probably taking a vacation and resting. But the reasons for working mums burning out are because of the maternal wall, the motherhood penalty, bias, injustice at work. Therefore, the solutions aren't take a vacation. The solutions are totally different. And I think that's where we're seeing this disconnect at the moment, where all the companies are going, it's self-care or it's mental health benefits programs. And it's like, okay, the people at the top have not experienced burnout through the same pathway. And kind of back to that model of Freudenberger and North, where you start at stage one and have to prove yourself. Now, that could be from perfectionism, people-pleasing, etc. It can also be because you belong to a group who are constantly having to reprove themselves. Women have been shown again and again, equal performance to a man, man's potential will be rated more highly. Research studies show this again and again. So we're having to reprove ourselves and we're having to work harder to get to the same place. So of course we're on this burnout cycle. And so that's the difference that I really want people to understand and think about.
And I think that's such a profound reflection. And it took me quite a few years from my burnout recovery to come to that realization, because like you, I got fiercely curious and like, how did this happen? How can I stop it happening again if I'm not sure why it happened in the first place? And unpicking all those layers. And I think it's such an important distinction. So thank you for sharing that and the work you're doing around this. So I'm really curious about, what did you actually do to overcome your burnout then? Take us on that journey. So you talked about in the first instance, you went into that kind of self-blame. It's obviously my fault, so I've got to fix it because it's me that's broken. Where did that then go to in terms of your recovery?
And I would say it's been 4 years now, and I feel like I'm in the recovery process. And I love that you said you had been 8 years ago. I think it's really important for people to understand that it can take quite a lot of time. And back to what you just said there, we're constantly trying to not go into burnout again. And the chances are we will in some ways. And it's like, can we recognize the symptoms sooner? And how long does it take us to find our solutions and enact the tools that we've learned along the way? So I know there's a lot of fear about going back to those places. So I wanted to mention that. Mm-hmm. So I think I had two kind of transitional points. One, COVID hit. And I had just got back from the UK. So my family had to then go into quarantine sooner than all the other schools went into lockdown. So I was in this sort of thought about quarantine for the next 2 weeks on our own. And I literally was like, what am I going to do? And I had been listening to a podcast from Tori Henderson. She's Supermom is Getting Tired. And you can call her as a coach. And so she actually took my question, because I was literally like, Tori, what am I going to do in the next 2 weeks? If only it's been 2 weeks. And she did an episode about that question. And then I went on and did coaching with her. But her sort of insight at that time was, the reason you don't want to spend 2 weeks with your kids is because what you tell yourself about the type of mother you are. You're constantly telling yourself, you're a bad mom. So of course you don't want to be with yourself in the next 2 weeks with your kids, because you're going to be mean to yourself. And so it was just, part of me was just so ashamed. And part of me was like, okay, this I've got to somehow work on. So coaching for me was definitely the turning point, because a coach can give you perspective, because you've lost perspective. When you're in burnout, you have lost all perspective. I mean, we've lost perspective as working mums, given the societal expectations we have and the expectations we're putting on ourselves. We don't have a clue what is reasonable behaviors anymore. So a coach can help you with that. And then they also give you permission. She was letting me give permission to let go of my parenting control. She was giving me permission to take parenting breaks. Yes, we're all stuck at home, but for goodness sake, you need to go and have a day where you are not at home with the kids. So that was so helpful to me. And I think that was really my turning point, moving from kind of self-reflection and even the reflection that the therapy had provided into being given tools, how to cope. So she really taught me a lot. Most of the exercises we did were about writing. I love writing. I am a writer professionally. And so it was a really great tool for me to continue to use in my sort of self-discovery. And she'd say, okay, write down all the things you do as a mum. Let's fact check here. Are you a bad mum? Write down everything you do completely. And so it was like this reality check. I tried to do so much for my kids. And then she was like, okay, can you actually thank yourself for everything you do here? And so, just shifting into these different mindsets. And then she very much taught me the Martha Beck thought models. And that was so helpful to me because and if people don't know what that is, it's like you write down a fact, you try and work out the thought you're having, the feeling you're having, feelings I wasn't admitting at all. So that was always a hard one for me. What is this feeling? And so she taught me how to find it in my body. Then what would be the action I'm taking and the result I'm having? So then, a lot of the time I struggled to change my thoughts. So what really I was able to do is say, okay, what are actions that I can take anyway that may change the thought, may not, but they still may put me in the right place for myself if the thoughts never change. And I think that's what's really hard. Of course, I want to try and have more self-belief. But another business coach I worked with said, maybe that's your Grand Canyon. Maybe you're just going to fall into that Grand Canyon again and again. But it's how long it takes you to get out of it. Can you get out of it more quickly? So I think that's so interesting because this last week I had done a talk about burnout and met with some people afterwards who wanted to get advice on their burnout. And I'm not a coach. I so respect coaches like you. The one-to-one work isn't really where it doesn't fill my cup, right? I much more prefer these systems and strategic thinking issues and the research and evaluation behind it. But when I was asking this particular person about had she tried to use thought models before, and she hadn't, and I was like, my goodness, all of us really need tools like that to help us. So that was really the start of me moving in a different direction and really starting to then write more and more, starting to write about my experience. And as I was writing, I was still trying to unpack what happened to me. And then when I started discovering the burnout literature, and I suddenly went, oh, that's what happened to me. That's what I experienced. Yes, I was overwhelmed and exhausted. Oh my goodness, I was cynical. And yes, I became very ineffective. And as I read more burnout books and heard more about things like resentment and rumination that I was experiencing, I was like, okay, this is what I've been through. Now I understand it. Now I can see the causes as well, because that's the thing, the workplace burnout. It is clearly the conditions are come from the workplace. So when I combined that with reading about how could I be a better manager and started to learn about the maternal wall and the motherhood penalty that I had no idea existed, I was like, I put it together and really was like, okay, these are the things that are going on. And as a public health behavior change scientist, I know how to solve complex problems like this. These are the complex problems I've been solving my whole career. So, but then I was also a little bit in that situation of, hey, I've not been a burnout researcher for 20 years. I've been a health behavior change researcher, which some of the behaviors I research are ones that can help you manage stress, but not a burnout researcher. So then when I worked with the coach, she was like, well, do you feel comfortable saying you're a burnout survivor? And that's what you bring. And then once I sort of stepped into that place, it just all came from there. I could talk about being a burnout survivor, and I could then come up with solutions based on again, my improv comedy unique approach to this thing. I was like, I know no one else is going to be thinking about it in exactly the same way, because this has come from my experience and my education and my training and stuff.
Oh, thank you for those reflections. And I love how you do your reflection. You can tell that your mind is this wealth of kind of research that you've explored and then related back to you kind of personally, interpersonally. And it's so amazing to hear. So when you talk about solutions to burnout, it's clear that you talk about it from a multi-level approach. So there's this kind of systemic view, and that you talk about it in terms of the seed and the soil. So you were the seed that was in the soil of your organization and your culture and your society. So from an institutional level, so if we were looking at the organizations, how does your approach to burnout intersect with diversity, equality, and inclusion?
Right. Thank you for that question. And as I mentioned before, when you think about that burnout cycle that you can get upon, if you're starting at that cycle of having to reprove yourself all the time, then that essentially comes from groups who are already disadvantaged and then being expected to continually prove to themselves. Because essentially we have stereotypes ingrained in our sort of brain superhighway. And if we want to interrupt those biases, we have to do so much to actually moderate those biases. And that's why you have to have training that develops skills and then practice those skills and get feedback on those skills. That's the behavior change process. Whereas most of our training about unconscious bias is just, be aware of these things. And that's definitely not sufficient. It might be a starting step, but it's not going to change those behaviors. So, even part of burnout is when our brains are exhausted and we're experiencing brain fog. The research shows, for example, that physicians become more biased, particularly racially biased in their behavior, the more burned out they are. And as their burnout recedes, their biases become less. So we know that even in that process, if we're exhausted and burnt out, all these biases that are already in the workplace are going to be basically getting worse, right? And so then those biases in the workplace, both men and women have those biases against mothers, against women of color. And so the lack of reward is systematic. The injustices are systematic in those systems. So that's where I partly see that burnout and bias really, really intersect. One, part of our brains being burnt out leads to bias. Two, the conditions for burnout come from bias. And three, the groups of people that are so often trying to solve these diversity, equity, and inclusion issues are often people who've experienced the disadvantage and who have potentially been re-traumatized in their role. And they're the ones that are not getting enough resources to actually solve these problems in the workplace. So they are also much more likely to burn out as well. So there's this sort of trifecta where burnout and bias in my mind just are so integrated. And so again, I don't want to take away from really specific, important DEI efforts, but I think if they are aligned with mental health efforts, then we can sort of have this sort of greater impact potentially and be approaching it from two prongs. So any mental health efforts should also be reducing bias that leads to the burnout. And so if you think of something like psychological safety, that's such an important component for being able to bring yourself to work and as a whole person come to work and feeling like you belong. That's in the DEI vein. But in the same vein, if you can't talk about the struggles you're having, either in your role or with your mental health at work, because it's not safe to do so, then one, you're going to think it's your own problem, back to thinking it's an individual problem, not a systems problem. And two, you're not going to get the help or the solutions you need. So I think that's so important that we, as a collective, make sure that collectively our voices are heard and elevate those problems to the next layer, level up, because managers really need to then be able to say, I have a systemic problem in my organization that we have to solve at a systems level. And then if we think of it coming from the top back down, so that's like the bottom up approach, but the top back down, for me, one of the biggest keys to solving these issues is to make them organizational key performance indicators, because that's what the National Academy of Medicine also says. If we're trying to prevent physician burnout, for example, this has to be at the hospital board level. So in the same way, it has to be at our company board levels. If the board are not holding themselves and the organization accountable at that level, then there won't be the investment. There won't be the prioritization. So that's why I think if it can then be elevated to this key performance indicator, everything flows from that. Because pretty soon, as you start to measure it as an indicator, you then are measuring how big the problem is, what groups are struggling with the problem particularly, and you start to realize, okay, we need specific solutions. But then you also see that self-care as a solution is extremely ineffective and also furthers the bias, because it comes back to, does everyone have the resources outside of work to have self-care? No. And even though I say, get a coach, that's the first step. If that coach isn't potentially subsidized by your employer, and that's what I say to people, ask for coaching to be subsidized, then again, the disparity is widened. So that's why we need these solutions at these systemic levels. And I really see that if it can come from that key performance indicator, then you'll actually start to say, hey, these self-care solutions, it's not changing anything. Our burnout levels are not changing, or they are in just this one group who already burnt out from this particular type of burnout and are potentially already successfully moving up through the organization because they don't have the same barriers. So, that's really what's so important. An indicator lets us do some of this analysis that we need to really get to the root causes and have these more appropriate solutions.
Yes. And I think the way you can shine a light on, because it's a complex web, as you're saying, it's so many different levels and layers to this, and influences on each of those different levels and layers, that it really, I think you do an amazing job of articulating it. And it's just making me think, when you talk about, having kind of burnout as a key performance indicator, or the opposite side of that, well-being, because all of the research shows that, high levels of well-being are correlated with lots of positive stuff in terms of engagement, work ethic, work quality, customer experience, motivation, and lower levels of absenteeism and all of those pieces. And actually, when we do have the low levels of well-being, as you've absolutely indicated, the data shows that we have higher number of HR incidents and compliance issues and kind of ethical integrity complaints, as well as all of the, employee engagement piece. So, it correlates really highly to be having it as a key performance indicator, because it influences so much in an organization.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's such an important shift to think about, is well-being comes before productivity and performance. I think the mental model of saying, if you have a good job that you enjoy, you will be happy, is, the problem is we need to, once people are actually working in conditions that support their well-being, then they'll be productive, then the performance will come. It's that way round, not the other way round. And I think that's the problem.
Absolutely. And I think you've highlighted really well, in terms of your own story, how easy it is to be slipping down the slide from, thriving to I'm striving, to then being in survival, to then being in languishing. And actually, it's like that boiling frog syndrome. When you're in that place for so long, you don't notice how hot the water's got, so that you're secretly and silently creeping down that scale. And, as you say, to be able to have the self-power and responsibility to say, oh, I'm struggling, can I have some support? Often we don't notice it. And that's where I think it's great that you're saying organisationally, we've got the responsibility here to provide the environments and the systems and the support so that we help people that may not have identified that they're slipping down that scale.
Right, exactly. And I think that shift happened also somewhat in public health when schools realised that kids were coming to school and they weren't getting good grades. So the schools started to worry because they were getting bad grades associated with their schools. At first, they kept saying it's the parents' responsibility to send the kids healthy to school. And when they realized, okay, we can't control that, and there's huge disparities in whether parents have the resources to send their kids to school healthy or not. And then schools started to, because the grades were associated with the student's health, right? There's a direct correlation there. They realized that. They were like, we have to help the kids. We have to provide nutritious meals. We have to provide physical activity opportunities. And to be honest now, we also have to provide mental health support to kids in schools. And that's what I love about that change and shift in the role schools see, is then everybody gets access to it, because at least in the UK and the US and many countries, most kids are going to school. So that at least once in the day, there is the opportunity for them, when they're at a place for quite many hours, to basically be getting the support they need that may be, for no fault of their own, not available to them outside of school. So I feel like if workplaces can sort of see that same shift, is if you want productivity and profitability, you need to also see that that's related to the health of your employees, and that you essentially can improve that by supporting them, and that this also helps us as a society as a whole to reduce disparities.
And I think it's clear that from the pandemic, that's more important than ever. So so we've talked about that from an organisational perspective. So if we then kind of shine the lens back on us as individuals, kind of as an individual and interpersonal level, what can we do as working mothers kind of inside our own homes and for ourselves that can help with avoiding or recovering from burnout?
Right. So at that interpersonal level, it's so important that we learn to basically understand what our needs are and communicate them so that we can then get help, because this is about asking for help. So one of the burnout models is sort of reduce the stressors and increase the resources. So reducing the stressors means that you let go of some of your expectations that you might have for yourself. And you say, okay, we're not doing as many sports. And if we are doing sports, I'm not standing by the sideline and watching the kids doing their sports. But also then, what things can I get help with? And I definitely found that asking for help the hardest one. Sometimes in the end, that's where you prioritize paying for help of different types. Or there are some apps and things where you can join like a village and exchange help. And I think that's much more a mentality that I feel comfortable with. I could do a carpool or make a meal for someone. But there's other things that I have less ability to do. So it's sort of working out those exchanges. And I think, again, that's one thing that we need to recognize, that as well as workplace burnout, there is parental burnout. And in that parental burnout model, where you're really no longer enjoying your role as a parent, leveraging the resources and reducing the stresses in the home is so important. But I also think it comes back to then saying, well, if you are asking for help, saying, what do I need? And the book that I love that really got this through to me was a British lady, Philippa Perry, and she had written the book every parent, the book you wish your parents had read. And in that, she really went through this process of, if you don't let your kids express their emotions, they won't understand what they want and what they need. And if they don't understand their emotions, they won't be able to communicate their needs. So it's really important that you let them express their emotions so they can follow that pathway to understanding their need. And when I listened to that and went, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense. I wasn't allowed to express my emotions. And so I, especially as a mum then, had no idea what I needed because you put everyone else's needs first. So that's where it's really important to start to understand what am I feeling? What do I need? And how can I communicate that? Now, quite often we might approach our husbands or a partner and say, okay, I need more help. And they're like, just tell me what you need. And you're so lost in that moment. And then thinking of all the millions of things you need help with, it's so hard. Whereas actually there's another book, Fair Play by Eve Rodsky. And she basically has outlined all the 100 tasks of parenting and managing the household. And essentially you sit down with your partner or your family members and the kids as well, and you say, who is doing what and how can we shift this balance? Now, this system doesn't necessarily work for everyone, and sometimes you definitely have struggles of the partner buying into it, but at least it's somewhere where you actually have a starting place to have this conversation. And this comes back to actually something that I know from my behaviors change research, which is if I ask people, what do you need to change your behavior? The answer always comes back, willpower. I'm like, okay. And everyone thinks that changing behaviors is easy and all they need is more willpower. So if I actually just ask people that question without giving them anything to reflect upon, I get a pretty unhelpful answer back. Whereas if actually we do a lot of small pilot study interventions where we give people a taste of what they could actually do and how they could do it, and then they get a sense of, oh, this is way more difficult than I thought. Here's all the things I actually need. So even if it's that in the home where this fair play system is like a straw man that you set up and everyone comes in and says, no, that's rubbish. But then they go, but this would work or this would work. It starts a conversation. And sometimes the system itself works for families. For me, what it did is taught me two things. One, my husband didn't want to take on more parenting tasks because he didn't like how I criticized him when he took those tasks upon. So he didn't want more of them. So that was a really hard one for me to hear and have to face, but he was totally right about that. And two, it wasn't that I needed more help from him. I needed a total break from parenting for long periods of time and to let him be the dad he wanted to be without me being there. And, I don't care if he gets into activities. I don't care what he feeds them. Just do whatever it is you want to do. The kids get to experience, dad and not following the rules, for example, which I love because he and I are quite different and they see these different ways of existing in the world. So it's good for them. It's good for him. And I get the parenting break. So that was the solution that we came to by he and I first having that very difficult conversation about who was doing what.
I love that. And I've had Eve on the show actually back in episode 45. She came and talked about fair play and the invisible load and how to navigate it. And it's just such a revolutionary approach to looking at all of those kind of 100 cards and thinking about it from who kind of owns it, who executes on it, who does the planning of it. And I love that it's created conversations in your home that may not have been what you expected as outcomes, but have moved you forward. I absolutely love that. So we've covered so much and so much goodness. But if there was just one thing that you hope a working mum who's listening to you today takes away from this, what would you want it to be?
Back to that asking for help. That was the first step that I had to take, and to admit that I needed it. And that I wasn't super mum and I couldn't do it all. And also that doing it all alone was so miserable as well. So it's really that first step of asking for help. And that's so hard. And if that help can be from a coach, then that is absolutely, in my mind, the most efficient way. Really, it is in the end the most cost-effective way to go, because I wasted a lot of money. Not wasted, I love books, but I spent a lot of money on a lot of books that I could have probably, avoided if I had focused more quickly on having a coach. And again, you can have a coach through your workplace, so ask your employer to subsidize a coach, because even if you're asking for professional development, a good coach will also give you personal development. But also, there's so many great coaches out there who have free masterclasses, who have podcasts, who provide a lot of free content. So it's really focusing in on that, giving yourself permission to do less and perspective on what you can let go of. And that's like the reducing the stresses. And then it's like, okay, what help do I need? And again, the help could be with those 100 tasks in the home, or the help could be in your workplace, getting help. And I think that's the thing, back to kind of the workplace in that situation. I remember asking for help with various things and not getting it. And I think that is also one of the things that really helps you realize things aren't going to change in this particular place I'm working in. So how can I start to set myself up to be able to find a different job? And quite often, severe burnout does result in changing jobs. And that's essentially, as you start to ask for help and are not getting your needs met, you start to sort of face that reality of, okay, something has to change.
Brilliant reflections. So I'm sure people are going to want to find out more about you and your work. Where would you point them towards? And I'll put all the links in the show notes for you.
Great. Well, you've mentioned my TEDx talk, so that can be found on YouTube, and it's called How to Stop Burnout Before It Starts, and that's under Jacqueline Kerr. And then my podcast is Overcoming Working Mum Burnout, and my website is drjacquelinekerr.com, and there you can find free resources on how to spot burnout in your employees. My podcast is there. Lots of blogs are there. And hopefully in the future too, I'm going to be able to start to develop some online courses for some of these issues, for if you're a mompreneur, how to prevent burnout, or how to prevent it in your teams, etc. So I'm hoping that that's where I can move into as well.
Oh, and I wish you every success on that, Jacqueline, because your work is so needed in this world.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. And as I really sort of talked about this with you today, and you identified how complex it is, I really found that episode that you had with Katie Murray, where you talked about being at the wall and just focusing on the brick in front of you and knowing other people are working on a brick nearby. That to me was such a fantastic perspective to say, this is a big, complicated wall, but let's just all chip away at it from our own perspective. And really, it is going to change. It's going to change.
Such a reassuring analogy again, isn't it? And yeah, that episode with Katie, I'll put a link in that in the notes as well, was also a really good one on this topic. But thank you, Dr. Jacqueline. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you for joining me so early in the morning from, is it Toronto that you're in? Oh, no.
I'm in Colorado today, normally San Diego, but an hour forward in Colorado. So it was a time change in the right direction.
That's good. Well, thank you for joining me so early.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too. So if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.